Castella Copeland, and Mr. Kevin Booker. He's not that black spot you saw, that's really him. And I have some special guests, Judy Katapay, Jabril Akbar, and Brian Chung. And also I'd like to give a heartfelt welcome and thanks to our new liaison, who is Mr. Patrick Mahan. He will serve as the new economic director starting tomorrow. So, but he's our boss now. So congratulations, Patrick, and welcome aboard. Today's conversation is entitled "The Rise of Asian Hate." As you know, last weekend, we dealt with weekend before last Jewish hate, and this weekend we're discussing Asian hate with these beautiful people that are our special guests. But first, I'd like to introduce all of them to you. I'm just going to say your names, my beautiful panelists, and then you can tell the audience a little bit about yourself and why you're here this afternoon. Before I introduce that man over there named Kevin Booker Jr. and Castella. Get that look off your face, Kevin. Welcome, Judy. This is Judy Katapay. She's one of our special panelists. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Judy Katapay. I was born and raised in the Philippines, and I've only actually been in this country for, I think, 6 years now. And I'm in this, I'm here because I want to be in a conversation where I could share my troubles as a person who does identify as Asian. And I also want to hear about the thoughts of other people who similarly experience the same things as me. And I think it's a really important conversation to have, especially in this climate. So yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Thank you for being here. We appreciate you giving us your time. Next is Jabril Akbar. Hi, Jabril. Welcome aboard.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Jabril Akbar. And while I was born here, I am South Asian on my father's side from Bangladesh. And I'm here because I do have a really big passion for human rights and equality. And I think it's really important to help facilitate this conversation if we do want things to get better and address issues like Asian hate, being Asian myself.
Excellent. Thank you, young man. And Brian Chung is our other special guest. Brian, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Yes, thank you so much. My name is Brian, he and pronouns. I am born and raised in Hong Kong, and I am here, I'm spending my 8th year in Connecticut right now on an international student visa. I graduated from Wesleyan University last year, and I now work at Wesleyan as a fellow with our civic engagement department. And in my off time, I am an organizer with Connecticut Democratic Socialists of America. I'm also a labor organizer as well, hoping to start the first undergraduate student labor union in Connecticut, and also the first in the country to be voluntarily recognized. And I'm here not just because my identity is very salient to me, but also because I think of the need to really talk about intersectionality, talk about the intersections of racial and particularly economic struggle in a very polarized and tumultuous time in our society, but where we're also seeing a lot of people step up to do what is right and step up to fight for justice and dignity. And I'm really excited to shine a light on some of those struggles today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time to be here. Also, we have another participant, but she's running a little late, but she will join us soon, Olivia Liu. So we'll stop and let her introduce herself as soon as she joins us. As always, I'd just like to thank our partners in this effort, along with ourselves, is First Church of Windsor, AME Church, Episcopal Church, and Grace Church, along with our town, a government that gives us the opportunity to present these programs to you. Also, if you know people that may be interested in this topic or any of our conversations, they are available on YouTube like the day after or so. And you can share these topics and, and look at our other discussions in the past that we've had. We are continuing these conversations. We will be taking a short break because we got to get ready for Juneteenth. So there's a lot going on in the world of human relations. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our other facilitator and host, Mr. Kevin L. Booker Jr. Thank you. He is a town council member of the town of New London. Thank you, Kevin. Welcome aboard. And thank you for joining us and taking the time to be with us here today. Would you care to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Judge Kevin Washington. It is an honor and pleasure to be here today. My name is Kevin L. Booker Jr. I'm a founder of Booker Empowerment LLC, where I do diversity training. My company was established in 2007. And I found my voice to fight for social justice when I was 12 years old, when I was in middle school, because I realized that it's very important to speak out about just injustices that you see. And that's something that I dedicated my entire life to. I'm a civil rights activist, and I'm a former city councilor, and I serve on various boards in Job Corps, Isaac Charter School, ADL, Anti-Defamation League, and various other boards as well. And I'm also an author as well, where I write children's books. I have 3 children's books that are coming out this year. And my motto is always get comfortable being uncomfortable. And I just want to say it is an honor and privilege to be among you all today. Thank you.
It is an honor and privilege to have you here, Kevin, as always. I'd like to ask that if you are expecting phone calls or that kind of thing, just mute yourself. If your video is working, we would love to see your face because we have a kind of different setup. I see you, Alex. That smile is magnetic. We'd love to see your faces. We have a kind of different setup. If you don't mind being on the video, we would appreciate it. I'd like to do a special shout out before I turn it over to Cassie, to our state representative, Jane Garibay, who's with us. Thank you, Jane, for being a part of this conversation as well. Thank you, Cassie. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So I'm Cassie, or my real name is Stella. You can call me either she, they pronouns. And we're going to get started with our lovely program. So I want to thank everybody for being here for this amazing program. So here is our start. We're going to start off by having some community guidelines here. So this is just going to help set up our space for everyone to feel safe and included in the conversations these are created. So these, we're going to start off with speak from the I. So speak from your own experience, not like he said, she said, they said, just from your own experience. Listen to understand one another. So there's going to be a lot of different perspectives shared. So we want to really lean into understanding that, and also leaning into discomfort and feelings. So sometimes, sorry about the dog. Sometimes we're going to lean into our own discomfort, being like, oh, this might hit me differently as a multiracial woman, right? So really kind of leaning into those different feelings. And we have confidentiality. So this is really some of the lessons that we learn will go out into the community, but we're going to kind of keep all of the shared stories here. And then we have be respectful. So online, it's staying muted, just kind of listening to each other. You can raise your hand, whether it's digitally or using your actual hands, either's fine. And we have participate and converse. So a lot of this is however much you put into this event is how much you're going to get out of it. So I encourage you to challenge yourself if you choose to. And finally, agree to disagree with grace. It's okay to just disagree. Like we all have different views, whether it's political, whether it's, with our own experiences, and that's okay. But that means that I don't have to hate you just because you have a different opinion. We can still have a conversation. It's called civil discourse. We can continue to have that with one another and just be like, you know what? I'll agree to disagree. And then we can just kind of move on and take it with respect. Is everyone good with this? Give it a little thumbs up if we're all good with it. Excellent. Great. Here's our brief agenda. We're going to go over the purpose of the event. We're going to have a couple of film snippets sneaked in throughout. So we're going to establish a common ground for everyone to be able to have this conversation. So whether you're an expert on the topic or this is all brand new to you, no worries. This is our little common ground. So that way, when we have a conversation, you'll have a little bit of context, a little bit of history, and a little bit of current events that are going on right now. So our objective here is to converse with one another on prejudice and bias against the Asian community and to reflect on what type of change can happen. So you're going to see a couple of different statistics, charts, and other visuals throughout the program. Later on, I'm going to send these slides to you. So if you want, you can click on each of these and you will be able to learn more information from some of these articles, because I know that this has increased, the hatred against the Asian community has increased as we've gone in further into COVID. All right, now we're going to go into our first film snippet. Feel free to use the chat if you would like to share some of your thoughts or kind of reactions to it. We will be having this film snippet within our discussion later on. Subtitles will be on, so if you need that, it's there as well. All right, we ready for our first film snippet? Hey, here we go.
Since a gunman went on a shooting rampage at 3 separate spas in Atlanta, Georgia. 8 people were killed. 6 of the victims were women of Asian descent. Authorities say the accused gunman told them a sexual addiction drove him to shoot the women, but the violence angered many in the Asian American community and stoked safety concerns. Recent data shows there were more than 6,000 hate incidents targeting AAPI individuals last year. For more, let's bring in Varun Nikor. He's the executive director of the AAPI Victory Alliance, which supports progressive Asian American and Pacific Islander candidates at all levels of government. Varun, welcome. Thanks very much for being with us. You know, before the shootings in Atlanta, anti-Asian sentiment in this country, as you know, had been building. But how do you think that tragedy changed the response from the AAPI community to hate and discrimination?
Well, you know, at a space level, what we did was we took this horrific act that happened a year ago, and we are building a movement. We are building power. We are ensuring that we don't just let these horrific deaths go in vain. But a lot of work still needs to be done to ensure that we study the community going forward. We are one of the most understudied demographics in the United States, and I think only then, when we spend more time and effort in studying the community, will we have an opportunity to get to the root causes of this hate and violence.
Yeah, in fact, recent data from the nonprofit group Stop AAPI Hate showed there were nearly 11,000 hate incidents reported between March of 2020 and December of 2021. Why do you think we continue to see such a high rate of these incidents?
Well, I don't think we can put our finger on exactly one cause. There are numerous causes. Mental health, of course, might be at the top of the list. But I think it goes to also the fact that there's a lot of angst still left in society as a tail end of the pandemic. But this gender-based violence perpetrated primarily against females, Asian American females, is continuing to rise. Recent stats also pointed to the fact that about 87% of Asians in the last year have faced some sort of discrimination. And so we need to continue studying this, as I said, but I think only then can we come up with a policy prescriptions and future legislation to help try to curtail this at a more systemic level.
Speaking of legislation, it's interesting because, as I understand it, Illinois became the first state in the nation to require the teaching of Asian American history in public schools. I believe that's set to begin this fall. And it was a bipartisan effort, from what I understand, Varun. There was political will to make that happen. What kind of legislative action do you think needs to be taken across the country in order to protect those in the AAPI community? Is it too early at this point to start talking about further legislation, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think that piece of legislation that you pointed to in Illinois is a fantastic example of several of the things that can be done. At the root cause of some of this hate and violence, frankly, is ignorance about who Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are in this country. To the extent that we can help demystify the, who we are as a people, our origin story coming into this country, right? I mean, we've had Chinese and Japanese Americans in this country for over 5 to 10 generations. And of course, we have newly arrived immigrants as well. That story really has to be told. And states like Illinois, we're at the forefront of this. And I think that sort of thing needs to be copied and cookie cuttered across the nation, just as a sort of a bare minimum. There's so much more we can be doing.
As we sit here speaking tonight, there are, we know, gatherings taking place across the country, including here in New York City, marking 1 year since the Atlanta shootings. What happens now, you think, Varun? You mentioned studying, the need to gather more data and get at really some of these root causes, but where do you think this movement to stop violence against AAPI individuals goes from here?
Well, I think, frankly, it really is starting to evolve, right? We have not really had a movement for Asian Americans in this country since the term Asian American was coined in the late 70s. And so from the indicators that I am seeing, more and more Asian Americans who in the past perhaps were not as civically engaged are starting to flex their muscles, flex that power on the local level. But it's really translating into political power also for the AAPI community. And whereas before, I would say 2016, before Donald Trump was president, Asian Americans, I think they just put their head down. They're the large population of AAPIs were first generation immigrants, about 60 to 65%. And we were not as involved in this day-to-day civic engagement process, and that's changed. And that trend, I think, is going to continue. We saw record levels of engagement in the 2020 election by the AAPI community. We saw it last year as an early warning in the Virginia election where I live. And so I think this is only going to increase in the future and create further opportunities for engagement for the AAPI community.
All right, Varun and Varun, thank you very much for joining us.
All right, so that is our first film snippet here. And that's just to provide current context for what is going on in or continuously going on in our country here. And here's some salient points. So after the election of Trump in 2016, a lot of things happened. All right. And one of the things that happened culturally for us that I want to highlight, not just because, I'm part of the millennial generation, but because memes have an impact. It's a way that we communicate. It's a way that we understand things, and it's also a way not only to educate people, but it's a way that people spread hatred. So there was this racist rhetoric seen in some of the memes here on the right. This was sent out quite a bit to a lot of people, and Trump himself coined the term the Kung Flu virus, which again is very, very harmful, very racist, right? Kind of perpetuating and continuing the bias, hatred, prejudice, and discrimination that will lead to a lot of violence against the AAPI community. Now you're going to see that a lot of this, it's not just a new thing. This has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. I'm just going to give a very brief synopsis because again, you can take entire courses and read a lot of books and see a lot of films just on how this has transformed and transpired over the years. And you can see this back when we started to allow them or the AAPI community to immigrate into the United States in the 1850s. They came over here to get some work, but as you know, there was a lot of slavery going on, and we had this system of labor where depending on your race and gender, you were paid less. But people don't realize that, Chinese laborers were instrumental in building some of our transportation systems, in building some of our biggest economic things that help our country run. But a lot of the policies and legislations really inhibited them from growth. And so we had a lot of the things and you can look up some of these things as well, which is the 1852 miners tax, the Anti-Coolie Act, the Anti-Opium Laws, the Exclusion Act, the Dawes Act, And the 13th Amendment, get this, it did not include Asians. It included like all these other people, but not Asians or Asian American or AAPI. So you will see that there is a great documentary on the Chinese Exclusion Act here. That's why I have this poster here on the right. I highly encourage you to check it out if you get the chance. And there's this incredible TV show that goes over all of these different acts. Like the way that they show all of these is truly incredible. It's very riveting. So if you get a chance to see this show called Warrior, I highly encourage you to watch it. It's not only like entertaining, but like they are depicting these laws in its true act without sugarcoating it. Then we have the 1900s. Again, very briefly, we had the Jim Crow laws. We had the executive order 9066, which actually George Takei has a personal narrative and a personal video on talking about his experience experiencing this, where they were publicly humiliated, put it into camps, and basically monitored and sometimes killed and brutally beaten for being Asian. And then we also have the 13th through the 15th Amendments, again, passed in the 1800s, but really weren't fully enacted until the next century. And you will see there is a connection between the AAPI community and the Black, Indigenous, People of Color community. I know so many acronyms, which again made it harder for people to access their rights. So you'll see I have a couple links. So if you want to do some more reading and research after this, I highly encourage that. Now getting to present day in the 2000s, a lot happened. A lot happened historically, transpiring up to present day. We had World War II, which was a really big war that impacted our country and the rest of the world. And to understand more of the AAPI experience, you can check it out here. We also have the Vietnam War. We have the Korean War, which is a really big part of the anti-Asian and dehumanization in how people are treated. And then we also have the Cold War, and finally the pandemic, which is a whole other can of worms. And you'll see here on the right that the coronavirus perceptions really have treated certain racial groups unfairly, more so than others. You can see right here that out of all the people who were impacted the most, the Asian and AAPI community has been impacted the hardest. Again, from that racist rhetoric that we see, from the memes, from how we are receiving information. So this is just to kind of get that snapshot. And next month is Asian Heritage Month. So I'm grateful that we're having it now so that we can start the conversation and then continue it with our actions next month. And this is the one of the graphs. Again, we saw this kind of very similar in the video that we just saw, but there has been an increase in violence as well. Now we're going to get to our second film snippet with George Takei. Woo! In Star Trek, he's amazing. Like if you ever get the chance to check out his stuff, he is truly amazing. So we're just going to watch this short film snippet, then I'll turn it over to all of our panelists.
Standing along with some historical perspective surrounding this moment, we wanted to talk with someone who's experienced the darkness firsthand. George Takei went from being in an internment camp as a child to a star Hollywood actor. I recently talked with him about his life experience and his thoughts on how to stop the rise in hate against the AAPI community. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's just start out with, it's a 1-year anniversary to the day of this the spa shooting that we saw in Atlanta. And I'm just curious why you think it is that we're seeing this uptick in this Asian American hate.
Well, the current one is prompted by a president who continued to refer to the coronavirus as the Chinese flu or Kung flu or Wuhan flu. It was a racist labeling done irresponsibly, recklessly by a president of the United States. But throughout our history, we've had the failure of political leadership that resulted in enormous suffering by Asian Americans.
Do you feel that people are doing a good job of being allies with Asian Americans who experience hate, or do you feel that there's a lot more still that needs to be done?
The people that are speaking up are as diverse as America. I was involved in the civil rights campaign back in the 50s and 60s. I am a nation, and I met Dr. King and shook hands with him. I met Eleanor Roosevelt as well. But you know, because we're a smaller minority and a growing one, it's easy to stereotype by this constant repetition of the old stereotypes.
And let's talk about a particular, I mean, America's had a number of dark spots in our history, but Japanese American internment camps and 120,000 Americans during World War II. You experienced that firsthand. Kind of give us a sense of your experience.
Well, I was 5 years old when two soldiers carrying rifles with shiny bayonets on stalked up to our front porch and with their fists began banging on the door. This is still a little known story of American history. We were forced out of our home on Garnet Street in Los Angeles, taken from a 2-bedroom home, first to the stables, horse stables of Santa Anita Racetrack, because the camps were being built. This was because of another president of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a great president during the 30s, who said to America, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. But when Pearl Harbor was bombed, that was a sneak attack. He became fearful and signed Executive Order 9066. We have a history, both from the top of the country, the presidency, as well as the yahoos who are ignorant and racist. Like all immigrants, they aspired to a new life, building a place for themselves in America, and someday aspiring to become naturalized citizens. Every immigrant coming to the United States could aspire to that, except immigrants coming from Asia. They were denied naturalized citizenship simply because of their race. And so from the moment that the Asian immigrants stepped on the soil of the United States, the kind of hate and discrimination that we are still experiencing today began.
And explain, as we talk about that, the idea of perpetual foreignness, what that is, and if you feel like you still experience that today.
Well, I'm a third generation. My grandparents came, and the thing is, there are immigrants from all races coming to America. The third generation, or fourth generation, or fifth generation are not considered foreigners, except people who look like this. And again, it's the problem of the white people, the majority, that continue to, because they see Asian immigrants coming, speaking with accents, having strange cultural customs. Many generations are still saddled with that perception that we are foreigners. We have Italians coming, we have Irish people coming, they speak with accents, but Italian Americans and Irish Americans are not considered forever foreigners. It's the media's challenge to get that right.
What do you credit your own personal progress and success to, you know, emerging from some of the darkest aspects of American history to going on to Hollywood and Star Trek fame?
I served with them for a long time. I owed them my life.
In your 60s, you came out as gay. In your 80s, still having this flourishing career and respect.
Oh my.
Say also to somebody who's experiencing their own oppression and struggling to feel like, hey, I matter too.
I'm a grandson of immigrants. They were farmers. They took scrap land, considered totally useless land in the Sacramento Delta, and they transformed it. So immigrants have been making something of themselves. We would like the media to see the totality of us, Americans, and not saying Asian Americans and immediately picturing ourselves as immigrants speaking with accents and struggling with American culture. We are Americans.
Oops. All right, so that is our second film snippet. And I think he does a really good job of kind of explaining some of these key terms. So you're going to see a lot of these terms going around, okay? Between Asian, Asian American, AAPI, or Asian American Pacific Islander, or Asian Pacific Islander Desi American, which is only the southern part. Then we also have a lot of different things that are changing, like the Asian American and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders, because again, language changes and how we understand how we want to label ourselves and treat one another with respect is going to change. So like, who knows, there might be even more later on. But I know one of the biggest arguments in either to use AAPI or not, just in a nutshell, is that there are some Pacific Islanders who say, look, I prefer to classify myself as indigenous instead of Asian. So again, these are kind of internal, but also very important conflicts at meeting ourselves at the intersection. So again, it's very complicated, constantly changing, just like the student experience and some of the experiences that we have. George Takei talked a bit about some of these concepts. Again, I know it's kind of a lot in a short amount of time, but kind of talking about like how there's this concept of a model minority of like, oh, well, if you have this race, you kind of should act like this. And oh, we will reward you, tokenism. Like, oh, well, this is like the model person. Like, so like it's kind of whitewashing those cultures. We have colorism where it's like the lighter you are, the better, more privilege you will have. Perpetual foreigner, which is what he was talking about, is how it's a stereotype that all Asian people must be from outside of the United States. You can't be American. Then we have white adjacent, which is a mix of privilege and exclusion. It's kind of being like white passing. Finally, the exoticization and exoticism of Asian American bodies. And you can see that in comfort women, especially in the Korean War, and how that is still perpetuated culturally at times. So again, very brief synopsis, and I'll send this over to y'all later, but we're gonna turn it over to our panelists. Again, lots of information to have a common ground. And I'm gonna turn it over to Kevin Booker Jr. to start us off with our first question.
Thank you very much, Costello. You know, George Takei just said, we are Americans. We are Americans. And the other day, Jabril and Judy, I asked you a question in class. And I said, you know, what is it like to live in your skin? So for the audience today, can you please describe what is it like living in your skin as an Asian American, and how has COVID-19 pandemic contribute to or exasperated the discrimination and racism you have faced? I'll start with you, Jabril.
So living as an Asian American here, I would say it is a very unique experience, especially being specifically South Asian, as kind of mentioned earlier, that heavy focus on the different labels. And a lot of times people kind of glance over South Asia as a part of Asia, with heavy focus on East Asia or Southeast Asia. And I do feel like that kind of view on my identity as an Asian, when I identify as such, people kind of give me an odd glance or somewhat like, sure about that. And especially during the pandemic, you know, having a large Asian community around me, seeing that with fear as, you know, these hate crimes rose, a lot of people would be scared to go out in public, and, you know, having to be careful, you know, and especially a lot of people would be like, you know, I'm not, you know, people who were born here, you know, saying people think I have these ties to these pandemic and whatnot, and that unfair treatment. And kind of, you know, the idea of a perpetual foreigner, people kind of always assume you're not from here, you know, you're different from us. And it kind of has affected kind of your point of view living here, being like, you know, am I different? But, you know, as George, like I said, we are all American at the end of the day, and despite what other people might try to say to you.
Wow. Thank you, Jabril. Thank you so much for your honesty, and being your vulnerability as well. Judy, same question directed towards you.
So my experience has actually been pretty harsh, like especially in the recent years with COVID. Like the Philippines is like more in the east side of Asia, so I do look a little bit more like how like people see Asians look like, and so it affected my experience a lot. So a little bit earlier in the start of COVID, I had to like stop going to the grocery stores like by myself, because like my parents were scared for my actual safety, even though like it's like a 10-minute walk, and they couldn't risk me going outside. Sorry. To buy groceries, like stuff that we actually need, we couldn't get because we were scared of getting hate crime.
Oh my gosh.
And then
Wow.
yeah, so and events that I had to go to like even later in the years where everyone could like leave their houses and stuff. Like I don't have a license, I don't have a car, and my parents both have work during the day, so I could only use public transportation. And my parents had to stop me from using that too, because then I'd get hate crime. Because before I told them because it's not really a proud experience that I'm proud of, but sometimes when I'm on the bus, like I hear like little snickers and like slurs, like the C word. I don't really like saying it. Yeah, so I do hear that when I'm on the bus. And oh, and when I was working at Dunkin', a customer denied the drink that I made because he thought it was dirty.
Oh my God.
So he gave the drink back, and the manager had to step in and remake the drink because he didn't want a drink that I made and I touched. It made me feel less like I didn't. It made me feel like I wasn't a person. Like like he saw my eyes and like, oh, you know, and especially knowing that this discrimination was empowered or like given strength by a president, a person who's supposed to be there for a country, the people of its country, and to hear that coming from them, and that those words that he used getting used against me, a person who lives in this country, who is actually really proud to be here. And it's just really difficult, and it's hard knowing that I'm not the only one who experiences this, and it's a shared experience, and that's what makes it worse. Sorry, I get really emotional, and like I see a lot of this happening like with my cousins too, not just like in terms of hate crime, it's just in terms of like their identity as Asian. And Americans, especially because they were born here, but they're like perpetual foreigners or something like that, because they were born here, but they aren't viewed as Americans. And then when they go home, they're not viewed as like people who are like us, because when they go home, they're like, oh, you're a foreigner because you weren't born here. So they don't have a place where they feel like they belong, and I have to hear it from them because they don't have anyone else to talk to. So I hear their experience all the time, and it hurts to see like the place where you were born and you're literally born there, they don't accept you, and the place where you feel like you should be accepted in because that's the people you identify with also don't accept you.
Wow.
It's really difficult, and I really hope it gets better.
Judy. No, Judy, thank you. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for just being your authentic self. Thank you. Thank you for all the great work you are doing and pouring into your community and also educating us. You know, I'm sorry that you have to deal with all this. But I thank you for your courage, because you are an amazing individual. Amazing individual. Absolutely. Amazing.
Thank you.
Brian, you have been sitting here listening in. What is on your mind, Brian? What comes to your mind right now as an activist, you know, you have a little bit more years on Judy and Jabril. What's coming, what's crossing your mind? What is it like for you? And what have you noticed as well?
Yeah, no, I'm both, you know, I feel fortunate and unfortunate to say that I have many experiences that resonate with what Judy has just said. And you know, Judy, I could not have imagined myself in high school coming onto a setting like this and being so brave and talking about your experiences like that. So from, you know, I know we're in the same generation, but just from you know, I graduated from college last year, but one Asian person to another, thank you so much for really just stepping up just now and you know, really being vulnerable with us, because that is a really hard thing to do. And I don't know, for me, it's I definitely resonate with, you know, the term perpetual foreigner. We really saw a lot of those themes. For me, it's most salient when I'm doing the political work, when I have to go and knock on people's doors, and I'll tell people, hey, you know, remind people there's an election, it's time to vote, you know, it's time to engage in your civic duty. And then people see an random Asian person knocking on the door, and it's like, whoa, like, what are you doing here? And you know, we know that there are a lot of you know, suburbs in Connecticut and Northeast that are really, really white. And you know, of course, anyone who is, you know, taking that step of going to engage with someone who they don't know at all is always taking a kind of risk. But I've definitely always felt, particularly because of the color of my skin, that I would always be perceived as an outsider to the community, as someone who is just, you know, who doesn't live around here, and as someone who, yeah, is just like, will automatically be viewed with suspicion or with a sort of, yeah, fear, just because of the color of my skin and what I appear to be. And I think of course, it's only been exacerbated during the pandemic. We're not only, I mean, and just the other day, right? Congressman Tim Ryan from Ohio was lambasted rightfully for releasing a disgusting attack ad. You know, as a Democrat, they're taking advantage of anti-Asian sentiment and, you know, xenophobia for his reelection campaign. And it's really just, we see this happen, you know, time and time again. And, you know, I myself, I was bullied in boarding school in Connecticut, right here, actually. And I was called slurs. There was this one particular white boy who would call me slurs, or would tell me, you can't actually say that to me. That's like, you can't, that's a racial slur, and it wouldn't stop. And it was tough, and it was like something I, like, for better or worse, had to learn to take on the chin. And I think I'm really glad, because the real conversation about Asian hate and also Asian discrimination really only, I think, really took off like over the last couple of years, which is too late, along with a lot of other causes that have risen to the surface way too late. But I'm really glad that you know, to see that people are finally stepping up to talk about this, that we finally have spaces like these where we can all be in community together. And, you know, especially with other minorities and with our allies, right, to really talk and brainstorm about how we can move forward together. And something I'm really hopeful and really looking forward about, especially coming out of the pandemic, really, is we're really, I think, has really exposed the sort of economic conditions that minorities, a lot of Asian Americans in this country, live under. Abject poverty, not having access to healthcare, not having access to housing, and we are seeing that the pandemic has made people reckon, especially people who are privileged, people who don't suffer from those problems, reckon with the reality that many Asian Americans work minimum wage jobs. And many Asian Americans, like many African Americans, like many other ethnic groups, you know, like brown, like Latinos, Hispanics, are workers in this country, and have gotten by, have only survived during the pandemic, while there are people making billions and billions, like gotten richer during the pandemic. And the pandemic has really exposed that reality, and I think are really bringing people together to fight against that. We are seeing Asian workers at the forefront of like union drives around the country, for example. That I think could only have happened with the sort of the catalyst of the pandemic really showing everyone sort of what are the common struggles that we are fighting together. And so I am reflecting very somberly, I think, among of the struggles that we have faced. But I'm actually very hopeful for yeah, exactly, right, for spaces like these and for the fights that we're continuing to fight.
Wow. I want to, thank the three of you for, just for being so, vulnerable and open to share your struggles with us all this evening in this space. Some of the statements I've heard so far: perpetual foreigner, perceived as an outsider, called racial slurs, living in the Northeast that is really predominantly white. It's hard navigating through those areas. And just thinking of those statements leads me to the second question. When you think about the Atlanta spa shooting in 2021, what are some social or cultural implications that contribute to how Asian American people are treated in regards to race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic status, and citizenship, and etc.? What comes to your mind? Brian, I see you shaking your head right now. Please.
Yeah, I mean, so I think this is really, like, I think that when we look at stuff like, crimes like these, spa shootings, tragedies, and these events that are, perpetrated by very bad people, we also see that it is routinely, like with all the other kinds of hate crimes that other minorities experience, routinely it is working class Asians and working class minorities experience the brunt of these. It's not like, massive Asian-owned businesses are being bombed or are being robbed. It's routinely those who are on the margins of our society, sex workers, or sometimes are sex workers, sometimes adjacent. It is, and exactly right. We go into the sort of cultural implications, right? A lot of people have said that it is very highly problematic, right, to associate sex work and the sex industry with Asian Americans, and I think the sort of we can talk about that this has become a stereotype, and also talk about the underlying economic conditions that precipitate the stereotype, which are not false, like they're not fake, people didn't conjure these things up out of nowhere, right? People, I think, are in these conditions, and these stereotypes have been developed because the systems of oppression and white supremacy have forced certain populations into these subsistence, survival like economic conditions. And I think that it's hard. It's at the same time, like as we talk about this, we also understand that Asian Americans in the United States have the largest wealth gap of any other minority, any other ethnic group in this country, and that is also a struggle that we have to wage, right? That we in this country that are really rich Asians, we can acknowledge the reality of that, and also acknowledge that we are not doing enough for working class Asians and working class minorities of all stratums, and the existence of one does not invalidate the other, and I think that it is we cannot let there are a lot of people who will want to get away with that kind of messaging, who will want to say, international students, right? Like those are all the Asians, right? They come to the United States and they take our education and they take our jobs. But that's not really what's going on. Like it's only like very one small side of the struggle that everyone is facing, and those of us in all these different positions, I think, are working towards ending multiple axes of these kinds of oppression. And I think we really need to develop a kind of like nuanced understanding. So yeah.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. Judy, what resonates with you in regards to this question? Thinking about, the Atlanta spa shooting in 2021, what are some social and or cultural implications that contribute on how Asian American people are treated, in regards to race, gender, sexual orientation, and etc.?
Yeah, so actually while we were watching the video on the Atlanta shooting, they said that it was something, the reason why I did it was because of something like sexual for like him. And going back to what Gustavo said earlier about comfort women and like connecting it now that there are a lot of people with fetishes, like Asian fetishes, something like that, where they search partners that exhibit Asian like characteristics. And that also goes back to history again with the presentation with Castella, and how in one of those articles it talks about how the US or like the military, the US military who were in Asian countries who were using comfort women, like created that system of like that belief or like that idea that Asian women or like, yeah, Asian women are dispensable like that. Like it's also a belief for them, like in the past, that life is cheaper in the Orient. Like that's in one of those articles. So they don't believe that Asian women's lives or Asian people in general, the lives of Asian people aren't as valuable as the rest of the population. And that's wrong. And that belief is still so strong. And it also talks about how that view of like how Asian women or Asian lives aren't or are cheaper in the Orient, like they don't, when they left the country in Asia, like that belief didn't get left behind. Like they brought it with them back here. So that idea like kind of circulated around, and now it's like kind of, I guess like that was their grandfathers, and now like those grandfathers like taught the kids now. And like obviously you see that now with like the Atlanta shooting, like that his grandfather probably had like something to do with that. And but I don't know if there is, I'm just saying maybe because that is in the past. Just that sexualization of Asian people is what I'm seeing here, and like that hate, like it's truly disturbing how that like came to now, and how their own beliefs that they created like turned that into their own hate towards a race that nothing, like we didn't do anything to them, they did something to us. Like it's just frustrating to me.
Asian women lives are not as valuable and cheaper. Perpetuated stereotypes that we have seen throughout centuries. Jabril, I know you are a history buff, and you are a person who is a political activist. And as you're sitting here right now, what comes to your mind about in regards to this question about the Atlanta?
Brian and Judy made some really great points, and kind of just reinforcing that, Judy was talking about the fetishization of Asian women, and kind of eventually this fetishization to the point of dehumanization, and Westerners kind of see them as less than human, and allows them to commit these hard acts, like the spa shooting. And and as you're saying, this is historically back. The United States has a history of colonization and imperialism in the East, like Brian also mentioned. And this sentiment remains. While most of it was overseas, the sentiment lives here, very much so. Like the brothels that were set up in Korea and Vietnam and whatnot. Kind of this token, and then kind of bouncing back to what Brian was saying about the socioeconomic status as well. A lot of people have this, as I mentioned, the model minority myth of Asians, and they see these, Asian doctors or other stereotypes and say, oh, all Asians must be like that, kind of ignoring that really big wealth gap of Asians and this conditions that a lot of Asians are forced to work into, like the spas, which typically do not have best working conditions. And a lot of people would criticize sex work that refuse to acknowledge the conditions that the women who are in sex work are under, which is the reason they have to work these jobs. So kind of just in addressing the problem in itself and kind of just looking at the blurred picture gives these slurred views of Asian people that are continuing to be perpetuated as shown in history.
Thank you, Jabril. Thank you so much. I want to thank the three of you for, for your courage, for your vulnerability, and for your passion, because it definitely was felt throughout this call, especially in regards to these couple of questions here. And as we move forward, I just want to thank all the audience members as well for your engagement and for listening and taking time out of your schedules to listen in today, this evening. Costello?
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And speaking of the audience, it's now your turn. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask our panelists, feel free to type in the chat or raise your hand. And we're going to take the next couple of minutes or so to kind of just have our conversation together here right now as a community. I seen Jane Garibay. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I don't know if everyone is aware, you probably are, but there's a bill, HB 5282, that will require public schools to implement history curriculum that includes the cultural, political, and social contributions of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Many of us have already co-sponsored it. Whatever you're doing out there, we have to put pressure because passing the Black American last year was not easy. Thankful to Bobby Gibson and Senator McCrory that we did pass it. And this is very important to move forward to bring that awareness. And I also thank all of you. Judy, I misspelled your name at first in the chat. I apologize. You were all very moving, but especially your story. It helped me to understand the emotions of what you go through. So I appreciate that, and I thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Go ahead, Florence.
I'd like to thank all three of you also. But, being a Black American and growing up in New Jersey, we had Asians who lived in our neighborhood. But to be honest with you, they all seem to be doing better than we were doing. So I'm finding out more and more about Asians that, to be honest with you, I guess it all started with, unfortunately, our president who started all the hate. Did we have all this hate before in the Asian community? I don't want to blame one person for it, but I'm learning a lot that I didn't know. And I'm really feeling a little upset, thinking that Asians have been treated that badly. Because in my neighborhood in New Jersey, they were all doing very well financially, our restaurants, and I just never really thought about it. And I guess I owe you an apology, but thank you very much. I'm learning a lot. Mm-hmm. Brian, I'd like to hear your idea on that.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
No, Florence, thank you so much for that question. I think it's those are the kinds of questions that are really hard to ask because it's we live under a system that pit minorities against each other instead of working with each other. And it is exactly like points like those people are like, oh, it is exactly because of that reason that, this and this group are bad or whether this problem doesn't actually exist. And I think we can sort of, I think we can go back to, I'm going to go back on my computer to the slide on the terms. And I am going back to the term white adjacent, which is a very real thing that has that Asian American, that some certain strata, right, connecting to colorism as well, certain strata of Asian Americans in the history of America have benefited from being adjacent to white supremacy, being adjacent to the purveyors of oppression, not only in this country, but also in around the world when the collaborators with colonial regimes, right? Those are I would say they are parallel. They need the exact same kind of adjacency that I think produce the kind of sort of differences that you observed in New Jersey, when in terms of that like kind of relative like economic disparity. And I think it still very much exists like here today, right? Like, again, with Asians having like this massive wealth gap, we can assume that there are a lot of very, very rich Asians. I just said the name of a movie, funnily enough. There are a class of very rich Asians that are like richer than the richest of the other minorities too, probably. And that is a problem. That is not something that I personally am okay with. I believe that those of us in each of these minorities who believe in ending this oppression have a responsibility to bring this disparity closer, or perhaps even eliminate them. And also, I think funny you talked about sort of like from way back when, and when exactly this hate started. I have with me here a very old pamphlet, a brief history on U.S. Asian labor from the 1930s, actually. Here it talks a lot about back when Asian workers came here to work, the gold mines, and there was a lot of farming as well, and then there was a lot of discrimination. Unions way back when did not allow Asian workers to affiliate with them, did not allow Asian workers to organize into them. It was actually the industrial workers of the world, which are quite a radical labor group that first back in 1905, when they formed in 1905, they started to they were the ones who took the first step to organize Asian workers. And we also see that Asian workers historically have been discriminated against by virtue of them being workers, by being denied and being arrested, in fact, for trying to engage in labor organizing. We're trying to organize their fellow Asian co-workers, right? This is not about, obviously we live in a society today that is much more sort of integrated. But back then, when you're denying Asians the right to organize, you're denying an entire class of people the opportunity to rise up of poverty, right? And I would say that exactly mirrors the kind of redlining. I would say that it mirrors redlining. It mirrors Jim Crow laws, the kind of political and economic systematic disenfranchisement that has created this sort of disparate economic outcomes we see today. So I know that took a lot of some places, but I just want to shed some light on what I think is a very, very important question and a very important issue that we don't talk nearly enough about.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing, Brian. Because there's oftentimes where, like, as you were saying before, we don't really talk about that intersection, whether it's even within like different traditionally marginalized races, right? That's why it's important that we have these policies and all these different educational opportunities to be able to bridge that gap, right? And be educated on one another's history, because there's quite a bit of parallels. I mean, respectfully, like there's very different histories from African Americans and Asian Americans, but there's a big intersection at one point where they were together and then against each other, together and then against each other. And a lot of that can be seen economically and racially as well. So I just thank you for sharing that. Are there any other questions that the audience has before we move on into our next couple? Go ahead, Judge.
You always have something to say. I just want to ask the question to Brian and Judy and Jabril. Given today, modern day, with shows that come on TV that depict your lifestyles, like Crazy Rich Asians and Fresh Off the Boat, I don't know if that's a true perception that people take away of how Asians are treated or they treat other people. What is your opinion of the way you're being depicted on live TV and the premise that, people are walking away that this is the way Asians are?
I talked about this now, so the only thing I'm going to say is I didn't like the movie enough to remember the correct name. Apparently, it's Crazy Rich and Not Very Rich. I got it wrong just now, and that's all I'll say. I'll pass the floor to Judy and Jabril.
For mine, It's really funny because Jabril and I joke about this all the time. But my family is like the literally like almost fit the entire like stereotypical Asian family, which I like joke around, but like, so like as you can see, like in Fresh Off the Boat, like the parents are really strict on their kids. Like they want to get these types of grades. Like the kids have certain responsibilities in the family. Like you're held to a certain standard, and like just that push from your parents to like do your best, like do better, be better. That's always present in my family, and I think like that also helps with like mental grit, especially like in the Asian community. Like we face so many different discriminations. Like we face different troubles as other minorities. Like yes, resilience. Like we have that in our blood. Like it's integrated in us. And that's why I think like despite all the discrimination like from before and even now, like we still manage to like get to places where we want to be, like even though like there's a lot of dissonance between the rest of the population and like some minorities, ours but too, like right now. We still manage to like do our best, do what we want to do, like give ourselves out there, be who we want to be because of that like mental resilience, mental grit that we were taught. Unfortunately, we had to be taught like growing up.
Thank you. And I'll follow that up with a question until Jabril comes back. I know that when you gave your recitation at the beginning of the program, you said when you go visit home that you're treated differently. How are you looked at as an Asian American person coming to your home or to your origin? How are you treated there? Are you, is there a caste system that you are considered in versus something else? How is that relative to when you do go home to visit?
Yeah, so there's definitely a system. So when this is so unfortunate, but when I go back home, like of course we then like get treated as foreigners now, which is really weird because I've only been here for 6 years, and when I go home, suddenly they like think that I can't speak the language anymore. Suddenly they think that I'd hate the food there now, and like they just think that I'm not their own people anymore. Like they suddenly like put me in this separate box of like American, and like you're not like us anymore, you've been colonized. Like that's what they always say, that I've been colonized, I've been like whitewashed, but I haven't been. Like
so you've lost they're saying you lost your authenticity.
Yes.
Oh.
So like when they try to speak to me like on messages and stuff, like they use English, and then they're like, and then when I respond to them in our language, they're like, you can still speak the language, like what is this, blah blah blah. And I'm like, yes, of course. Like
wow.
And it hurts to see that now I'm viewed as someone differently, and here like I'm not viewed as an American. I'm viewed as Filipino, and then it like causes some sort of like internal fight of like who I really am and who I can be to whichever people. And so it really messes with you.
Brian, did you have the same experience when you go home?
Well, I think Hong Kong is well, I benefit from coming from somewhere where there's just like a very long history of people going abroad for education because of colonialism, right? Because my parents' generation, they actually got subsidized by the government to go do college in the UK, but what I experienced actually is something more internal. It's me realizing, wow, I like look up some news from back home, and suddenly like each time I read, I can understand and read less and less of the characters because I'm just so out of practice. And the sort of every time I get into gathering with Hong Kongers, like, wow, like my Cantonese is starting to become a little bit accented, a little bit sort of rusty here and there. There's certain characters that, wait, how do I say that again? And that stuff hits you. It's like, wow, I am not like as rooted or grounded as I thought I was before. And it's really, it's a very hard feeling to grapple with. And because also it's at the same time, it's like I'm here in America, particularly because I'm pursuing a different kind of experience that is not an experience I could find back home, or that isn't this. I'm not necessarily seeking for the same kind of culture experience, but this is also part of who I am, and to sort of have to wrestle with that is interesting, and is something that I'll continue to think a lot about. I'm grateful that of the Asian American spaces and Asian American communities in Connecticut specifically, that I think help sort of ground us and root us in our identities.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing, Brian.
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just had a quick question in regards to something that Florence she touched on briefly within her question to Brian, and that was based off of the model minority, right? Because like as Florence said earlier, she said she grew up in New Jersey and she didn't see the fact that Asian Americans were struggling at the same level as Black Americans or other minority groups as well. So Brian, I know you're a history buff and I know you have that background knowledge when it comes to just policies and social activism as well. Can you give a brief history on why Asian Americans are perceived as the model minority within the United States?
I don't think I necessarily give a fully accurate recount. I'll rely on sort of other folks here to fill in the blanks with me if they can. But I think that definitely. So I think the real backdrop of all this that cannot be ignored is that the migration, the first wave of Asian Americans. Well, even that's get a little bit complicated. But the first wave was kind of in the backdrop of wars, in the backdrop of imperialism and colonialism. And sort of the exploitation of the home countries, but also at the same time the creation of economic channels that led people to go abroad to like seek the different opportunities, leaving a homeland that was ravaged by war. And then obviously I also think we there's the issue of Hawaii, which I think is a very, very complicated question as well, because that involves indigenous sovereignty. It involves essentially a hostile military takeover by the United States. But also, but that's sort of that aside, going back to in terms of like what has led to like the model minority. I think we sort of go back to the sort of white adjacency. I think you go back to I think it's connected to sort of certain cultural tendencies of ours. We're more collectivist over in that half of the world. We are more likely to consolidate like within and like stay within our own communities for security and safety, and then we just kind of keep our head down and try and do our best and show that we mean no harm and we are not trying to take up any of anyone's resources. We just want to be here and do our own thing, and that is the least offensive kind of minority group you can be, not the kind of minority group that goes out onto the streets, that boycotts buses, that marches on Washington, that declares that they have a dream that little boys and little girls of various races can interact together in harmony. And I think that that's really complicated. I experienced that myself, especially as someone in politics and someone who at times needs to speak up about it. It's like, wow, like I do feel scared about this, and I would rather just not have to say this sometimes and just retreat into the security and safety of people that I share an identity with. And I understand how the sort of systemic pressures would cause individuals to a bunch of individuals in a collective to act together for the security of just that collective and not the other minority collectives in America, because it was survival. But I think that it's not to say that we don't have struggles nowadays that put us in those kind of modalities, but we also are evolving, like just by virtue again of having spaces like these, we're understanding that we can build those kind of solidarity across racial boundaries, and and deconstruct the notion of modern minority, right? That to abolish the idea that there is a correct way to be a non-white minority, there is a correct way to resist oppression, and there's a correct way to speak up about injustice. I think we're moving away from those ideas, and I for one, I'm really excited about that.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And I love how you were talking about how we have to really stand up for and with each other, because like in the cycle and system of oppression, we are taught like, or socialized, we're taught like, oh, well, this is how we treat each other. And that's why we have to disrupt that bias and hatred, because it comes down to each of those behaviors. So thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. And that kind of gets us into our next question, because it is very action oriented, and I'll put it in the chat as well for everybody to see. So our next question is, what types of trainings or action would you like to see that would help support the Asian and Asian American community? Is there enough educations or discussions today? And I'll start with Jabril. Would you like to go ahead? I know you're a little frozen before, but go ahead.
Okay, that's a great question, and I'd like to kind of go back to what a question Jane asked earlier about the bill about Asian American education and the history of that. I think that's a great step, first step, kind of putting that education on early on in the school system. For example, in my case, in my schooling, I was not made aware of the Japanese internment camps until I was around in the 8th grade. And I had grown up, hearing about slavery and Hispanic issues and other issues, but it was not until I was 8th grade I heard about the Japanese internment camps, and I was thinking to myself, how could I have gone so long, without this big piece of American war history? We were putting people into the camps, and kind of what some people had said earlier about, not being fully aware of Asian hate, and I feel like that's a big thing because it's simply not brought to the forefront. This massive history of imperialism and colonialism in Asia, and kind of a lot of it goes unspoken, and instead pointed to this model minority, like, hey, look, you guys are doing well now, and kind of brushing everything else under the rug when it does need to be spoken about, so that we can move forward properly. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing, Jabril, because there's no good stereotype. Because I know people ask that all the time, like, isn't it good that Asians have this stereotype that they're great at math? And it's kind of like, no, you're right. It undermines like all the effort. It's like, it's not a compliment. There's no good stereotype. It only perpetuates. So thank you so much, Jabril, for sharing that. Judy, then Brian, would you like to answer the question? What types of training or action would you like to see? Is there enough or not?
I would also just like to add to what Jabril said about how how he thinks, that what's happening right now with the bill is really great, because honestly, before I read the articles that Castella put on the presentation, like I wasn't really aware of that history of like how of the labor, like Chinese labor and stuff like that. I wasn't aware of that because I did come here very late. But like, so I didn't have enough knowledge about that. And so reading about it now, and like knowing that I wasn't taught this in middle school or like at all, like it felt a little bit like I was not being seen, like the history wasn't seen, although like I wasn't part of that, like it's still like, I always say my people, like the people who I identify with like had to experience that, but their experiences, like their history, like what they went through, like aren't being told and like aren't being made aware. Like people aren't being made aware of that, and it hurts to see how unseen this part of the minority is. And like I love how like the more, unfortunately, it had to take like a lot of discrimination, a lot of like incidents of like hate crimes for this to happen, to actually be brought up. But like where there's darkness, there's also light. So like, like I'm grateful that this is happening right now.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Judy, for sharing. All right, Brian, go ahead. What types of education and action? Is there enough or not?
So I think everyone here brought up great things. And I come from this from like here literally, right, as a foreigner, right? I don't understand really what is taught in America generally. But I can tell from what I was taught back at home, what we are not taught is the radical history of oppressed peoples fighting back. And that stuff is not taught enough. And you know, I often like to bring up two examples of really radical Asian Americans in history who were side by side and shoulder to shoulder with radical African Americans fighting for civil rights and fighting for justice and liberation. One of them is Grace Lee Boggs, you know, very famous Asian American activist and writer who was you know, very well known for as well of her association with CLR James from the Trinidadian, you know, liberation movement. And then you have people like Yuri Kochiyama, who was you know, very radical during the civil rights movement, and you know, well known with her association with Malcolm X and her advocate for, you know, a multi-racial sort of, you know, movement for justice. And I think that of course we definitely cannot afford to not learn about the histories of oppression and the history of tragedy. But I think it is just as important, if not more so, to show us what the path is forward to continue dismantling these oppressive systems. And I think that means learning about all of those in history who have attempted to fight back, and sort of the ground that they have made every time. And I think that, and I think this may sort of bleed into one of our later questions too, but I just recently came out of a union organizing campaign. And that was wild. This was a union at a private university in America that was led by a majority of Asians. You know, actually a fellow Hong Konger of mine and also an international student was on the organizing committee of this union drive. And up there with him was an international student from Malaysia and an international student from Singapore. And these are all Asians with no different skin colors. They're from different Asian countries. And like this weird system, this real world has brought them all together here at Wesleyan to create the first undergraduate labor union in Connecticut, right? And the first to be voluntarily recognized in the country. And what we're seeing from here is the sort of engaging in collective struggle, engaging in resisting the systems that try to divide us, are really like the sort of recipe for solidarity. And I think that we, I think I would like to see sort of more education and training and action around that. I think we're seeing, you know, with Amazon, with Starbucks, all across the country, right? There are a dozen shops every day are filing for union elections, while yeah, like while the CEO is saying, oh, you know, you don't need this. We treat our workers well already. And you know, like I guess I think that it's we have a tendency to still view struggles as separate when they're all intimately tied together by the systems that make these struggles necessary in the first place. So.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing. Yeah, there is that intersectionality, which I know that's going to get into our other event later on in April. And it's been a thread throughout all these conversations because we have to get to know one another at our intersections, right? We're not just our race. We also have that religion, all these different components as well. So thank you so much for sharing, Brian. Before we get to a really interesting audience question that I got in the chat here, Kevin, go ahead, or Judge Kevin. I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, maybe Kevin Booker won't throw me off again. So anyway, I want to ask the question, why is there not a lot spoken about the Asian participation in civil rights movements? Why is that not up there with African American history and Latinx history? Why don't we hear about the leaders in the Asian community and those that promoted civil rights and human rights? Maybe Brian could answer that question, maybe Jabril or Judy. I just want to know because I haven't heard a lot about Asian civil rights leaders.
Go ahead, Judy.
Going back to what Brian said earlier about how like Asians are viewed as the model minorities because we aren't seen as people who like put themselves out, like we just want to do like what we want to do, like on just be what we want to be. And that also like comes with that mindset of our elders who unfortunately look down on people who go to protests, or like because they don't want to see, yeah, like a lot of elders frown upon like action like that. So I guess that's why and we as Asian people, like we respect our elders, like that's embedded in our culture. We respect people who are older than us, we respect authority. So we tend to like shy away from things that do disrupt that like type of system. So I feel like although there are people who Asian people who do like stand up and like fight for that, a lot of the majority tend to like try and not make that as big of a deal as it is, because we don't want the whole like collective, like as Brian said earlier, we're a collectivist community, so we try to like move in ways where our collective isn't like affected in a negative way. Although like I love when they protest, like I love when people take action to like what they believe in, but unfortunately not a lot of Asian people believe that in that same way. So I think that's why a lot of leaders who are participants of the civil rights movement aren't as known as other ones.
Excellent. And what I would like to know your opinions of William Thong. They are saying that our first Asian American Attorney General. I'm proud that he's in that position. I've met the gentleman several times. He is an awesome individual.
I actually had the opportunity 2 years ago to speak at a press conference with him, which I was very, very lucky to do. What was happening at the time was that the Trump administration was trying to deport all international students in the United States who did not have an in-person class. And AG Tong was joining AGs from a bunch of other states to file lawsuits against ICE, against customs, for doing something that's not constitutional, doing something that's not legal. Yeah, I was really thankful for his advocacy at the time. I love that he has the Chinese character of his last name on his campaign literature. I think it's really, really cool. We're seeing a lot of political candidates from minority backgrounds being very unabashed about where they come from across the country. And that stuff is really exciting to see. And definitely to Judy's point, really, really resonates because my mom, growing up, has always sort of told me, don't get involved in politics. Go doctor, like that stuff. That part of that's the stereotypes are based in some form of truth. And what she said was, don't do politics because it's where people they'll get in trouble and they lose their freedom and perhaps they lose their lives sometimes. And I think it's and I think it's unfortunate that her generation was sort of maybe brought up in a time where the prospect for protests and the prospect for struggle seemed much sort of less hopeful. But I think we are in a different time now, and I think we are seeing a lot of Asian people across the country are stepping up, not just for themselves, but for the collective well-being of all in this country.
Thank you, Brian and Judy. I appreciate you.
Mm-hmm. And before we move to the next question, Jabril, do you have any thoughts and opinions on the Attorney General or any of the questions so far?
So I think the Asian Attorney General is a great stride forward. And kind of to go off what Brian said, a lot of times you do see this underrepresentation of Asians within policymakers and lawmakers. I was the other day I was reading this article. I believe the representation rate of Asians in attorneys is less than 3%, which is less than we make up in the population. So it is significantly disproportionate. And then once you do have a significantly less amount of Asians involved in the process, you're unable to pass legislator and laws for us. And it is important to have that because, as they were saying, the elders have these ideas of, don't go into politics, don't get your hands dirty, don't get messy. It's a bad idea. And that's kind of the only way we can move forward if people are willing to get their hands messy and create these conversations that make people uncomfortable. And because if you are stay passive, then you're an unwilling instigator in your own sorry, listen to the word, your own oppression, and creating these new generation of activists is important if we want to move forward.
Absolutely. Well said. So thank you so much for sharing, Jabril, because a lot of this, vulnerability takes practice. It's not something where it's like you just wake up one day and be like, yeah, let's go. It takes a lot of practice, a lot of mentors, a lot of people, a lot of education as well. So again, it's getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, but then doing something about it, not just being like, I'm uncomfortable, let me go type something on the internet. It's like, no, you got to do more. Like, how are you going to now talk with people? How are you going to now treat people when you see them at the coffee shop, at the grocery store, when you're walking on the street, when you're in school? So it's again how we treat people. And thank you everyone for participating in the chat. I see a lot as well, like comments on being inspired by Michelle Wu's leadership. I know I've been inspired by a lot of Asian American athletes like Michelle Kwan and Christian Yamaguchi, and like that's a whole other like conversation, not only with TV and media, as Judge Kevin was talking about before, but within athletics. But I digress because I got this awesome question in the chat here, and I'm gonna.
Did you do the triple sow cow?
No, I don't do triples, only doubles. I'm a figure skater as well, but yeah, it's amazing to see like the incredible impact that these athletes have had, even on figure skaters or people who weren't in figure skating. Like we recognize their names. They not only like made an international impact, but that impacted like how people can see themselves in media. Because when you see yourself represented, like I know when I see mixed people represented as a multi-racial woman, it's just like, it makes me feel like, wow, like if she can do that, I can do that. Or if I see he's up there, like I can do that. Wow, I feel visible. And that's a part of it, is seeing your story in there. But there are plot twists in the story. And here's one for you all. I got this great question. The person will remain anonymous, but here it is. It's, do you think Asian or Asian American, the Asian American community should be included in the acronym Black Indigenous People of Color? And how is the Asian American Pacific Islander and the Black Indigenous People of Color acronym kind of like, or that grouping, similar or different? Does colorism play a role? I know this is like a loaded kind of 1-2 punch, so take a minute. That's why I typed it up. Take a minute to read it. Should we have that distinction between AAPI and BIPOC? Should they be separate? Is there a connection? Again, plot twist in the story. So take a minute to think about it, and then I'll just go around how I see you all on my screen, and we'll start off with Jabril.
So this is a really interesting question. And so I'll take this piece by piece. I do think Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders should be included under the label, because there is a wide diversity within Asians themselves. Me myself being a South Asian, I'm brown, and I would definitely consider that part of people under the dual color label, and I do think that's also important for building that overall minority solidarity. Because once you build up these, putting everybody in a specific category and keeping with this division, that kind of keeps us from moving forward together as a progressive. And how are API and BIPOC similar and different? So I'd say they are both similar, and they do have their historic struggles and their uprises. They've both been affected by things like colonialism and imperialism, and this white supremacy. And how does colorism play a role? So I'd say colorism is a really big thing as well. Being myself a brown person who identifies as Asian, within the community, there has been a lot of second glances when I identify as Asian. People will look at me and be like, "Are you sure about that?" You know, and I'd say because people have this expectation of what it means to be Asian, you know, and colorism within the community as well. This label of white adjacent, you know, when you kind of put these people into these specific really boxes, people will say, oh, you know, you have to be this shade of yellow to be Asian, or so and so, you know. And the term Asian itself has been growing up from Asian to now AAPI, including Pacific Islanders. So I'd say labels, in a way, can hold us back from addressing the true issues of, you know, this unity that at the end of the day we're all trying to work towards.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing, Jabril. Because again, it's kind of like it's nice to have it, but at the same time, like how can we really come together? Because I know this question actually is going to lead into our final one. But thank you so much for sharing, Jabril. We'll go to Judy, then Brian.
All right. So actually the first thought that came into my mind when I read this question was that it should be up to the people who are in the BIPOC like community to like say if we should like if the Asian American community should be in it. But then like I thought about what Jabril said and how like those labels kind of like create like division between the two when we're all like, and what you said too, Castella, that we're all moving towards the same goal. But like that division of labels, which is like can be nice because then you'd feel like, oh, I'm being recognized, like I know where I am, like I know this is where I belong. And then like that also kind of creates like a sense of division, as I said before. And also like that kind of comes into colorism too. Like I that's like my own internalized like colorism. I'm so sorry that like, oh, like what's different is like the skin color. And I'm like, that is, oh, I felt terrible like thinking about that, like how it's so internalized that even I like who fight against like these kind of things like also like somehow like think that way, that oh it's like the different like the different skin colors have different like issues that they're fighting for, but when like literally in the sense like we're all just fighting together. And also like one of the big things that I like really believe in is that like race is just a social construct, like it's not really something that we should put importance to. Like we are people, like we our insides are all the same, it's just how we are on the outside. So we should come together as like people just in general to like fighting against an injustice. And yeah, like colorism, if we like forget about like color, like just people. And so that's my take on that.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing, Judy. Yeah, because it's interesting, especially when you put in colorism. I've seen like from firsthand when I've traveled abroad to a lot of different countries where like it's big, like, you know, skin bleaching, like now there's like this pill out where like it changes like the part of the composition of your body to try to like produce less melanin. And like in the beauty industry, like, whoo, like beauty and colors, and that's a whole other thing. Go ahead, Judy. I know you have another thing. Go ahead.
Sorry, like when you said about that, like in the Philippines, I remember like being so obsessed, like before I came here, like I was actually so obsessed with the idea of like the whiter my skin is, like the prettier I am, or like if my eyes aren't blue, like I'm not pretty. If my hair isn't blonde, I'm not like pretty. Like that was the whole thing. And everyone else, like every person in my class, everyone in my class were all like, we need to get this soap, like the Kojic soap, because it like makes your skin whiter, things like that. And like it also comes into with media and how like they always portray like that type of skin color, that type of like just appearance in general, like that's the appearance, that's how you want to look like, this is how you want to be, like this is a picture of a person who you should be to be successful, to be pretty, to be like considered as someone who's important. And that's so wrong. And unfortunately, it's so like deeply embedded in like a lot of minorities' minds, which is so unfortunate. And like having these conversations is so important. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing, Judy. Then we're going to come over to Brian for our loaded question here. What are your thoughts?
I think both Jabriel and Judy gave very good answers. And I think what I will add is I feel like most often when I hear that acronym be used in the situations that I'm in, not all of the minorities invoked in that term are present and their interests are not being considered. And it seems to me that, I understand, right? Like certain like things just become societal shorthand and it just becomes easier. But I do think that there is a certain irony in that this term was developed specifically by, I'm sure like my guess is probably some radical like academic circles to benefit like a specific kind of usage, a specific kind of research, a specific kind of like cultural and racial considerations. But I definitely think it's been co-opted to an extent, and I do think that I think we benefit from moving away from generalities in general when we talk about any of these kinds of things, and that includes the acronyms that we use, that includes the peoples that we name when we talk about oppression and we talk about social justice. And I think that I think that essentially sums up my view about that question. Maybe a little bit evasive, but I guess because my answer essentially abolished the term. But I do think that there is something lost in BIPOC being the all-encompassing term for everything, and essentially allows people to get away with not specifying what kinds of struggles that they're talking about and what kinds of people's welfares and interests that they're talking about.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing, Brian, and everyone on the panel here. And this kind of gets a lot of your responses are really talking about how we really need to have more connectedness. And sometimes I know, Jabril, you were talking about how it's great that we have these terms, but like it's kind of divisive. So how can we now bridge this gap or kind of bridge this across one another? How can different minority groups build solidarity together? How can we actually be there for one another? Like if I am a multiracial woman, which I am, how can we now have solidarity with the Asian community, maybe with the African community, with the Latinx community, right? So I'm going to put this question in the chat, and then Jabril, if you want to start, I'm just going in the same order each time.
So this is a really great question, and it's also really important towards these next steps, because a lot of times there's a strong history of minority groups being pitted against each other. And once you have that, it is harder to build that solidarity since there's this large historical background. And now we have it where a lot of minority groups are struggling to do so. So I feel like a really big step is building these conversations like this in which, we talk about our histories and then we realize that we're not so different after all, like was kind of brought earlier, these large shared histories between, different minority groups like African Americans and Asian Americans. And while vastly different and uniquely special in their own right, there are overlapping, laws that affected us equally. And, kind of bridging that gap is the next step in conversations. Another thing is looking within ourselves and our own prejudice, like Judy mentioned earlier. She felt bad about some of her own colorism, and that's something I struggled within myself, being a brown person, and just kind of struggling with these Eurocentric beauty standards as well, like she mentioned. Looking within yourself and seeing what you can do on your own, and reaching out to these other minority groups as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing, Jabril. Yeah, because a lot of it starts from within. There's no self-help book or guide that will really, be the all-knowing answer. It's that internal work that we each and every one of us have to do. So thank you so much for sharing. Judy, go ahead. How can we find solidarity within minority groups?
Just like what Jabril said, knowing about how each and every one of us struggle and how our struggles overlap, how our successes overlap, how basically just our lives in general, how they overlap and what we face through our day-to-day lives. I feel like understanding that depth, that a person is more than just their color, a person is more than just how they look on the outside, actually getting to know them and seeing what they face will let us understand that, I'm just like you, you're forgetting race and stuff, I experienced the same thing as you, and like we can share about this, like knowing that you're not alone can create solidarity. I mean, yes, like solidarity, like because like just knowing even that like like my friend Kyla, she's not in the same race as me, but we have the same struggles. Our family struggles are the same. I can relate to her struggles. She can relate to mine. So that created like a bond like within us that I really know that she has my back. I know that I have her back, so that like it makes a connection stronger knowing the struggles. So I think we just have to get to know each other better, learn the history of each other, just get that depth inside you. So like even internalize like discrimination, internalize things like that you really can't help yourself, like will slowly over time like get diminished, you know?
Yep, absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing. Yeah, so listening with empathy. Like not like, oh, I got to respond to what Judy's saying, so maybe she'll like it if I say this. No, I want to understand and really like get to know you for you, not the mask that we wear every day. So thank you so much, Judy, for sharing. And lastly, Brian, how do you think we should have some solidarity here?
Well, fun fact for the audience is that I actually proposed this question during our prep call, and I surprisingly don't. I mean, I probably already said this, already touched on that in some of my earlier responses. But I think, firstly, I definitely agree that we that the understanding is just so important, and because there are like we can do a lot of this stuff and actually still know remarkably, like, you know, I've just sat the entire session and actually know remarkably little about some of the folks that I hear. You know, it's trust and solidarity is predicated on you know, a sort of mutual understanding from a social nature and also in a cultural nature. And also, but I think sort of even beyond that, I want to go back to what I said before about waging common struggle. And I think part of that is not ever turning a blind eye to a problem that is, you know, you perceive to be not in your community. You know, I'm reminded of, you know, the sort of famous refrain, you know, the whole like, oh, you know, first they came for the Jews and I did not care because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for the Unionists because I didn't care because I was a Unionist. And then, you know, and then came for me and there was no one left to be in solidarity with me. Yeah, I think the very important lesson from that refrain is that all of our struggles are intimately connected, even in ways that we cannot perceive and we cannot see. And it's, you know, fighting a struggle on one front is in a sense fighting a struggle in a different front. And I think to me, again, like this is the most salient in the labor struggle and the revitalized labor movement that is unfolding across the country right now, which myself and, you know, other Asian Americans at Wesleyan are super proud to be a part of. And we really see that when we sit down together at the table and we look at each other like we're equals, and you say, oh, you know what, I kind of hate this job. Do you kind of hate this job too? Okay, word. Let's you know, organize together and make our jobs suck less. And it's not necessarily that, you know, the racial divide sort of fall away, even though they do kind of fall away, right? In the sort of in the actual experience of collective organizing and collective struggle. But really, in a sense, we are also highlighting, right, throughout this way, we're highlighting why this union is so important. It's exactly because our residential life staff here are overrepresented in people of color, overrepresented in Black and brown students, overrepresented in first generation low income students, overrepresented in international students, which are also, you know, overrepresented from Asian populations. All of these things are connected, and that is fundamentally like, and there was no intentional effort, right, to make our leadership like, you know, majority women of color, majority international students, majority Asian students, but it is from the conditions, right, of the organizing that emerged naturally a diverse leadership. And I think that, you know, I really think that the future is bright for solidarity across all racial groups. You know, just again, by virtue of being in this panel right now, which I'm just so happy to see that we have all sorts of different people from different backgrounds here. It's really so beautiful to see. And I do think that is something that's like really, and I come from somewhere where I am like the vast majority of the population, where Han Chinese people are the vast majority of the population, right? Where there are also minorities of Filipinos, of Nepalese, of Indians, of Pakistanis. And I do appreciate that being in America puts me in a position where I have to think about the fact that we are all minorities, waging common struggle. And I am, deeply appreciative of being here and experiencing that with all of you today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Very well said, Brian. Really talking about how we have to establish that common ground. So like you said, it's just like all of these are connected. I think of the roots of the tree, like tree of life. We're literally all connected. Like Judy said, like we are all pink. I know Janelle Monáe has a song called Pink, and she's talking about how at the end of the day, if you look inside, all of our flesh is pink. So we really need to have that ability to listen empathetically, to meet one another where we're at, and then create that change. So I really thank each and every one of you for coming here to be a part of this discussion. If you'd like to check out some of the resources and everything, here's the presentation. You can click on the pictures and the hyperlinks. There's lots of videos that we have. Shout out to Judge Washington and some others who helped me put in some of the videos and resources. I think it will truly be amazing if you want to continue that education and have more conversations this upcoming May. As a reminder, it is Asian Heritage Month, in a few weeks. So I'll turn it over to Judge Kevin Washington. Go ahead.
Well, first, I'd like to thank you, Cassie, for the outstanding job that you did. And Mr. Kevin Booker, thank you so much for being a part. And now that you all have met my three children, Jabril, Judith, and Brian, now I can tell you I'm their new dad, okay? So thank you all for being here. They're my children from another mother, brother, sister. So I just love all three of you. You are so expressive, and I appreciate your thoughts, your emotion, and everything that you put into this conversation. Without young people like you, we will falter. But as long as the three of you are representative, you have a bright future ahead of yourselves. I can tell you that. Thank you all. Thank all three of you for being here. Again, thank you, Kevin, for your part in this, and Cassie. Thank you to the audience. I appreciate you all attending this. We will have one more, which is going to be Cassie's specialty on the intersection of race. I think, is it in April or the later part of April or May, Cassie?
Yes. It is Sunday, April 24th. We're going to have an earlier time from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So all you need is a piece of paper and pen if you have it. If not, just bring your awesome self, and we're going to have a great activity to understand what it means to meet yourself at the intersection of who you are, all your intersections.
So I appreciate you all being here. Again, if you want to, we have our own site, our human relations site under community development, if you want to check that out. And all of our past conversations are on YouTube. Again, thanks to Patrick, our new liaison. We really appreciate you, and we welcome you aboard, sir. We will get this internet system down for you, okay? So until the next time, please look out for the email with the next conversation information. Be sure to register and bring your friends.